Prince Andrew has been arrested. He has been charged. He has stood in a courtroom and faced criminal counts. A jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with a guilty verdict on multiple counts. And that should make you furious. Not because justice was served, but because of what it reveals. Hundreds of men were involved in Jeffrey Epstein's network. Only one got arrested. Is this fair? Because here's the full picture. Before the arrest, before the trial, the Duke of York reached a civil settlement with Virginia Giuffre, the woman who accused him of sexually assaulting her when she was 17 years old. The settlement terms were not publicly disclosed. Andrew paid, Virginia signed. The case was dismissed. No admission of guilt, no finding of fact, no trial, no testimony under oath, no cross-examination, no verdict. Just money changing hands and everyone walking away. For years, that was it. A civil settlement and lost royal titles. That's not justice. That's reputation management. Then something changed. The arrest itself unfolded with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested someone, somewhere, had finally decided that protection was no longer tenable. Royal protection officers, the same Met Police whose institution had declined to investigate Andrew for years, found themselves in the surreal position of standing aside while their charge was placed under arrest. Don't let them fool you. Andrew Mountbatten wasn't arrested for crimes against children. He was arrested because he gave up state secrets. The treason charges transformed the story from a sordid tale of royal misbehavior into something far more dangerous for the establishment. Evidence that Andrew had, in his entanglement with Epstein's network, compromised national security. But here's what makes it worse. Even this unprecedented prosecution of a prince is more than any American associated with Epstein has faced. Hundreds of men were involved in Jeffrey Epstein's network. Only one has faced any legal consequence on American soil, Ghislaine Maxwell, and she's a woman. The man at the center of it all died in his cell. The powerful men who flew on his plane, visited his properties, appeared in his photographs. They're still free, still wealthy, still protected. It's the United States' turn to start arresting these gross criminals. That's what people have been saying since the Epstein case exploded. That's what they're still saying. And they're right. The UK finally arrested someone. America hasn't arrested anyone. Both nations protected the powerful for years. One finally cracked under pressure. The other hasn't even managed that for most of the names on those flight logs. The difference is stark. The UK prosecuted and convicted a prince. The US hasn't even managed a settlement from most of the Americans implicated. Let me tell you about the world Jeffrey Epstein built. Not the sanitized version that appears in careful legal filings. The actual world, as described by victims, witnesses, and the occasional document that slipped through the cracks of his elaborate protection scheme. Epstein operated out of a Manhattan townhouse on the Upper East Side, the largest private residence in the city. Inside the house, visitors described bizarre decorations that seemed designed to unsettle anyone who entered. A painting of Bill Clinton in a dress displayed prominently. Walls lined with what guests described as eyeballs embedded in the decor. The aesthetic was deliberately transgressive, a signal that normal rules didn't apply within these walls. Then there was Little St. James, Epstein's private Caribbean island. The locals called it Pedophile Island, years before the FBI ever set foot there. Manicured grounds, including a main residence, guest houses, a library, and a cinema. Workers who maintained the island described strict protocols. Never make eye contact with guests, never ask questions, never discuss what you see. The security systems were extensive. Cameras everywhere. Entry points monitored. The island was designed to be a fortress, keeping the outside world out and keeping whatever happened inside contained. The flight logs for Epstein's private jet documented a constant stream of passengers traveling between New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, Paris, and the Caribbean. The manifests included names that would make headlines when they eventually leaked: politicians, academics, business titans, celebrities, royalty. Many of these passengers would later insist they had no knowledge of Epstein's crimes, that they had only met him casually, that they had never witnessed anything inappropriate. The flight logs suggested otherwise. Some names appeared once or twice. Some appeared dozens of times over years of travel. Prince Andrew's name appeared on those logs. His friendship with Epstein began around 1999, reportedly introduced through Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell was Epstein's longtime associate, girlfriend, procurer, co-conspirator, depending on which testimony you read. She was the daughter of disgraced media mogul Robert Maxwell. Ghislaine moved to New York after her father's death and attached herself to Epstein's operation with a tenacity that prosecutors would later characterize as central to the entire criminal enterprise. The friendship between Andrew and Epstein wasn't casual. It wasn't a matter of attending the same charity gala once and being photographed together. Andrew stayed at Epstein's properties. He flew on Epstein's planes. He maintained the relationship even after Epstein's first arrest in 2006, even after Epstein pleaded guilty in 2008 to procuring a minor for prostitution, even after Epstein became a registered sex offender. In 2010, 2 years after Epstein's conviction, Andrew was photographed walking with Epstein in Central Park. The images showed them strolling together, engaged in conversation, clearly comfortable in each other's company. This wasn't a chance encounter at a public event. This was a deliberate meeting with a convicted sex offender. When the photographs surfaced, they ignited a scandal that would ultimately contribute to Andrew's resignation as the UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment in 2011. But the photograph that would truly define the scandal wasn't taken in Central Park. The photograph shows Prince Andrew standing with his arm around the bare midriff of a teenage girl. The girl is Virginia Roberts, later Virginia Giuffre, who was 17 years old when the picture was taken. Behind them, Ghislaine Maxwell smiles at the camera. The setting is Maxwell's London townhouse. The year is 2001. Virginia Giuffre would later testify that she was trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell. She alleged that she was groomed by Maxwell, trained to perform massage and sexual services for Epstein and his associates, and flown around the world as part of a traveling entourage of young women and girls. She alleged that she had sexual encounters with Prince Andrew. Andrew denied everything. He denied having any sexual contact with Giuffre. He denied even remembering meeting her. When confronted with the photograph, the undeniable, metadata-verified, corroborated photograph showing his arm around her waist, he suggested it might have been fabricated, doctored, a fake hand superimposed onto a real body. The photograph wasn't fake. Analysis confirmed it. Witnesses confirmed it. The denials only made things worse. For years, nothing happened. The photograph existed. The allegations existed. The testimony existed. The Metropolitan Police reviewed the evidence and announced in 2021 that they would not be taking any action against the Duke of York. The decision was made without any formal victim interviews in the UK, without any attempt to gather evidence from British locations, without any of the investigative steps that would have been automatic had the accused been anyone other than the son of the reigning monarch. The Met statement was carefully worded. They had reviewed the matter twice before and saw no basis to reopen. The subtext was clear. Royal protection, both the literal security detail and the institutional deference, would not be breached. Then came the interview. In November 2019, Prince Andrew sat down with BBC Newsnight for what his advisors apparently believed would be an opportunity to clear the air. What actually happened was one of the most catastrophic public relations disasters in modern royal history. The interviewer asked about his friendship with Epstein. Andrew replied that it had been useful for business purposes. He expressed no regret about the friendship, only about the consequences it had brought upon himself. She asked about the photograph with Virginia Giuffre. Andrew claimed he had no memory of meeting her. He did not dispute the photograph's authenticity, but suggested there were a number of things that are wrong with it, without specifying what those things were. She asked about Giuffre's specific allegation that Andrew had been sweating heavily when they danced before the alleged assault. Andrew's response would become instantly notorious. He claimed he had a medical condition that prevented him from sweating at the time. Photographs quickly surfaced showing Andrew sweating at various public events over the years. The claim collapsed under the weight of easily verifiable evidence. She asked about his stay at Epstein's Manhattan mansion in 2010, the visit that produced the Central Park photographs. Andrew acknowledged staying at the house for several days. His explanation? It was a convenient place to stay. He said he had gone specifically to tell Epstein that their friendship could no longer continue. Why he needed to stay multiple nights at a convicted sex offender's home to deliver this message was not explained. She asked if he had any regrets. Andrew said he regretted letting the side down, meaning the royal family, but stopped short of expressing any remorse for the victims. The interview was a disaster by any measure. Communications experts would later describe it as one of the worst crisis management decisions in modern history. Andrew's advisors had apparently believed that his royal bearing and natural confidence would carry him through difficult questions. Instead, the public saw a man offering implausible explanations with apparent conviction, seemingly unable to understand why his answers weren't being accepted, lacking any visible empathy for the young women who had been exploited by his friend. Within days, the fallout began. Organizations began distancing themselves from Andrew. Sponsors and partners announced they were reviewing their associations. The pressure became unbearable. Days after the interview aired, Prince Andrew announced he was stepping back from public duties for the foreseeable future. His statement acknowledged that his association with Jeffrey Epstein had become a major disruption to the royal family's work. He expressed sympathy for those affected and said he was willing to help any appropriate law enforcement agency with their investigations. That willingness would later be questioned. American prosecutors claimed they requested to interview Andrew and received no meaningful cooperation. Andrew's team disputed this characterization, but no interview ever took place. Then came 2022. Virginia Giuffre had filed a civil lawsuit against Andrew, alleging sexual assault and battery. Andrew's legal team attempted to have the case dismissed. The judge rejected this argument, ruling that the case could proceed to trial. A trial would have meant testimony. It would have meant cross-examination. It would have meant Andrew sitting in a federal courtroom while evidence was presented about his activities with a convicted sex trafficker. It would have meant the royal family watching one of its own subjected to the American civil justice system in a case involving allegations of sexual assault against a trafficking victim. The palace moved to contain the damage. Buckingham Palace announced that Queen Elizabeth II had stripped Prince Andrew of his military affiliations and royal patronages. He would no longer use the title His Royal Highness in any official capacity. He would defend the civil case as a private citizen. The Queen had effectively expelled her own son from the working royal family. He retained his title as Duke of York, but the ceremonial positions that had given him purpose and identity were gone. The Colonel of the Grenadier Guards, the Royal Naval and Royal Air Force ranks, the charitable patronages, all stripped. Weeks later, the settlement was announced. The financial terms were not disclosed in court filings. Andrew made no admission of guilt. He acknowledged that Virginia Giuffre was an established victim of abuse and that he regretted his association with Epstein. The case was dismissed. For years, that appeared to be the entirety of the legal consequence Prince Andrew would face: a civil settlement and loss of ceremonial positions. The arrogant buffoon thought he's protected by his birthright. And then, the arrest changed everything. The arrest took place at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. Witnesses described Andrew emerging from the house, his face bearing the expression of a man who had convinced himself that this day would never arrive. That protection had finally, definitively, failed. As he was led to the waiting vehicle, there was reportedly a moment when he looked back at the house, at the life he had built on the assumption that being born into royalty meant permanent immunity from consequence, and seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that the rules had changed. The prosecution's case rested on multiple pillars: the testimony of victims who had spent years waiting for this day, the financial evidence connecting Andrew to payments he should never have received, properties he should never have been able to afford, and the intelligence evidence, intercepts, signals intelligence, and testimony describing the compromising of a prince in real time. The defense attempted the same strategies that had worked in the civil settlement: casting doubt on the credibility of witnesses, questioning the authenticity of documents. But the criminal proceeding required a different calculation entirely. His claim not to sweat was contradicted by photographs from multiple events showing perspiration. His claim not to remember meeting Virginia Giuffre was contradicted by the photograph showing his arm around her. His claim that the photograph might have been fabricated was contradicted by forensic analysis that would have taken place years earlier had anyone in authority actually wanted to know the truth. The verdict, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense was inadequate. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with a guilty verdict on multiple counts. Andrew stood motionless as the verdict was read, his face betraying nothing, though witnesses described seeing his hands tremble slightly as the final word was pronounced. Guilty. A prince of the realm, guilty. A son of the late queen, guilty. And here's what makes it worse. Even this unprecedented conviction of a prince is more than any American associated with Epstein has faced. Let me tell you about the American side of this story. Jeffrey Epstein was first arrested in 2006 after a woman reported to Palm Beach police that her 14-year-old stepdaughter had been paid $300 for a sexual encounter at Epstein's mansion. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police identified dozens of victims. They gathered evidence of a systematic operation in which young girls were recruited, often from difficult circumstances, with promises of money for massage services that invariably became sexual. The girls were told to recruit other girls, creating a pyramid of victims that numbered in the dozens and eventually in the hundreds. The case was handed to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. Federal prosecutors prepared an indictment charging Epstein with federal sex trafficking offenses that could have resulted in a life sentence. Then something happened. Alexander Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for Southern Florida, began negotiating with Epstein's legal team. What emerged from these negotiations was one of the most controversial plea deals in American legal history. In 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 Florida state charges: soliciting a minor for prostitution and procuring a person under age 18 for prostitution. Not federal charges, not sex trafficking. State charges that allowed for the most lenient possible sentence. He received 13 months in county jail. Not federal prison, county jail. And even that was structured to minimize the impact. Under a work release program, Epstein was permitted to leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to work at his Palm Beach office. He served 13 months and was released in 2009. The deal also included a non-prosecution agreement, a federal agreement not to charge Epstein with federal crimes in exchange for his guilty plea to state charges. This agreement contained a provision that would become infamous. It extended immunity to any potential co-conspirators of Epstein. The co-conspirators were not named. Their identities remained secret, but the agreement protected them from federal prosecution for any offenses related to the case. Who were these co-conspirators? The agreement didn't say. Prosecutors have never publicly identified them, but the implication was clear. There were other people involved in Epstein's crimes, people important enough that the federal government agreed to protect them as part of a deal that gave a serial child abuser 13 months in county jail with work release. When the deal became public years later, it sparked outrage. Victims who had cooperated with the federal investigation said they had never been told about the non-prosecution agreement. The Crime Victims' Rights Act requires prosecutors to notify victims before reaching plea agreements, but Epstein's victims were kept in the dark. A federal judge later ruled that the deal violated victims' rights, though the ruling came too late to undo it. In July 2019, Epstein was arrested again. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York charged him with sex trafficking and sex trafficking conspiracy. The charges were not covered by the non-prosecution agreement, which applied only to the Southern District of Florida. It seemed, finally, that Epstein would face real consequences. He was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan pending trial. Then, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was suicide by hanging. No one has been held criminally responsible for the failure to prevent his death. With Epstein dead, the primary defendant in the federal case was gone. Victims who had waited years for justice watched their chance for a trial evaporate. The criminal case was closed, but the investigation continued, at least in theory. Prosecutors said they were pursuing others who had facilitated Epstein's crimes. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested and charged with sex trafficking conspiracy, transporting a minor for illegal sexual activity, and perjury. Her trial proceeded. The prosecution presented testimony from women who described being recruited by Maxwell as teenagers, groomed with gifts and attention, and ultimately delivered to Epstein for sexual abuse. Maxwell's defense argued that she was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes, that she was being held responsible because the public wanted someone to punish, and the actual perpetrator was dead. The jury convicted Maxwell. She was sentenced to federal prison. And that's where it stopped. One dead man, one imprisoned woman. That's the sum total of criminal accountability for a trafficking operation that spanned decades, continents, and hundreds of victims on American soil. The flight logs still exist. The names are still there. The men who visited Epstein's properties dozens of times, who appeared in photographs with young women, whose connections to Epstein were documented in contemporaneous records, they're still free, still wealthy, still powerful, still completely untouched by the American justice system. Some of these men have been publicly identified. Their names have appeared in unsealed court documents, in victim testimony, in news reports. Some have denied any involvement in Epstein's crimes. Some have remained silent. All of them share one characteristic. None of them have been charged. The non-prosecution agreement technically expired with Epstein's death. You can't grant immunity in perpetuity to unnamed individuals. But no charges have been brought against any of the potential co-conspirators it was designed to protect. The Southern District of New York, which brought the charges against Epstein and Maxwell, has not announced any further indictments. The FBI has not publicized any ongoing investigations targeting specific individuals. The official position appears to be that justice has been served. Epstein is dead. Maxwell is in prison. Case closed. Move along. It's the United States' turn to start arresting these gross criminals. That's what people have been saying for years. That's what they're still saying. And the silence from American law enforcement grows more deafening with each passing month. Consider what we know. Consider the evidence that exists in public records, unsealed documents, and victim testimony. We know that Epstein's operation involved dozens of employees who facilitated his crimes. Household staff who scheduled appointments with young women, pilots who flew victims to his properties, administrative assistants who organized travel and managed calendars, security personnel who maintained surveillance systems throughout his homes. These employees have described in depositions and interviews a culture of deliberate ignorance. They were told not to ask questions. They were told not to look too closely at what was happening. They signed non-disclosure agreements and were paid well enough to maintain their silence. But some of them talked eventually. They described what they saw. Young women, girls, really, arriving at Epstein's properties at all hours. Schedules blocked out for massage. Instructions to prepare specific rooms before certain guests arrived. The systematic nature of the operation was obvious to anyone paying attention, and they were paid specifically not to pay attention. Have any of these employees been charged with conspiracy? With facilitating sex trafficking? With any crime at all? No. We know that Epstein's financial operation involved a network of banks, attorneys, and financial advisors who managed his money. Banks maintained relationships with Epstein for years after his 2008 conviction, even as internal compliance officers flagged accounts for suspicious activity. Some banks eventually settled with victims. No one went to prison. No executives were charged. The banks paid money, a cost of doing business, and continued operating. We know that Epstein's legal team included some of the most prominent attorneys in America. These lawyers negotiated the sweetheart deal in 2008. They structured agreements designed to silence victims. They crafted legal strategies that prioritized protecting their client over accountability for his crimes. Attorneys are ethically prohibited from assisting clients in ongoing or future crimes. When a lawyer helps a client evade responsibility for crimes they know are being committed, that's not legal representation. That's complicity. Has any attorney involved in protecting Epstein faced bar discipline, criminal charges, any consequence at all? No. We know that Epstein cultivated relationships with prominent scientists, academics, and intellectuals. He donated millions to prestigious universities, including Harvard and MIT. He positioned himself as a philanthropist interested in scientific research, even as he continued to abuse young women. Some of these academics visited his properties. Some accepted his money. Some praised him publicly even after his conviction. Did any of them know what was happening? Did any of them see things they should have reported? Did any of them choose to look the other way because the money was good and the connections were valuable? These questions have never been seriously investigated, and we know that powerful men visited Epstein's properties repeatedly. The flight logs document their travel. The photographs document their presence. Victim testimony has named some of them as participants in abuse. These allegations have been made publicly, in court filings, under oath. Where are the investigations? Where are the grand juries? Where are the indictments? The contrast with Prince Andrew's situation highlights the complete failure of the American system. Britain prosecuted and convicted a prince. American victims of American perpetrators have been blocked by statutes of limitations, silenced by non-disclosure agreements, dismissed as unreliable. The criminal case against Andrew proceeded because the wall of protection finally broke. How many American perpetrators still hide behind walls that haven't even cracked? Andrew faced a trial where evidence was presented and a verdict was rendered. American figures connected to Epstein have faced what? Some negative press coverage? Quickly forgotten? Brief social media outrage that faded within news cycles? They've kept their positions, their wealth, their influence. Andrew was convicted. American perpetrators haven't lost anything. They sit on boards. They run companies. They attend galas and charity events. They live their lives as if nothing happened. The message from the American justice system couldn't be clearer. Wealth protects you. Power protects you. Connections protect you. You can associate with a convicted sex trafficker, visit his properties, appear in his flight logs, and face no consequences whatsoever as long as you're sufficiently important. This is what makes the public anger so justified. It's not that people expected perfect accountability. They understand the world is unjust. It's that the injustice is so blatant, so systematic, so obviously intentional. The system isn't failing. The system is working exactly as designed, protecting the people it was built to protect. Root cause analysis has become increasingly critical as organizations recognize that surface-level error descriptions obscure systemic problems, requiring fundamental solutions rather than temporary patches. Andrew, in this framework, represents exactly such a temporary patch, a single conviction offered to a public hungry for justice, while the systemic problems that enabled decades of abuse remain untouched in America. The evidence that exists could fill courtrooms for years. The flight logs alone, documenting who went where, when, how often, represent a roadmap for investigation. Each name on those logs should have triggered a thorough review. What were they doing there? What did they see? What did they participate in? Instead, the logs were treated as a source of gossip and speculation, not a foundation for prosecution. The victim's testimony provides detail that corroborates documentary evidence. Women who were girls when they were trafficked have described specific encounters with specific individuals at specific times and places. Their accounts can be checked against flight logs, calendars, and other records. The consistency and detail of this testimony would be compelling evidence in any courtroom, if anyone bothered to bring it to court. The financial records show how money flowed through Epstein's operation, who paid whom, which institutions were involved. Following money is the most basic investigative technique in white-collar crime. The money trail from Epstein's operation leads to banks, law firms, foundations, and individuals. Each connection is a potential charge. Each transaction is potential evidence. Each person who touched that money is potentially liable. None of this has resulted in American indictments against Epstein's associates. The standard explanation is that these cases are complex, international dimensions, multiple jurisdictions, wealthy defendants with resources to fight charges, the difficulty of proving crimes that occurred years or decades ago. But complexity is not impossibility. The Maxwell prosecution demonstrated that charges can be brought and convictions obtained even in difficult cases. Andrew's conviction demonstrated that even royalty can be held accountable. The civil lawsuits that have been filed against banks and other institutions show that evidence exists and can be marshaled. The obstacles are real but not insurmountable. What's lacking is will. What's lacking is the decision by prosecutors to prioritize these cases, to allocate resources, to take on defendants who can afford the best legal representation. Prosecutors are political actors with political calculations. They pursue cases they think they can win, cases that will advance their careers, cases that won't generate too much blowback from powerful interests. Prosecuting a dead billionaire's network of wealthy and connected associates doesn't fit that profile. Too many enemies to make, too many complications to navigate, too much risk that the case blows up in your face. Easier to declare victory with Maxwell's conviction and move on. And so the men who participated in Epstein's crimes continue their lives undisturbed. Think about what that means. Think about what message that sends. It tells victims that their suffering doesn't matter, that they can come forward, tell their stories, endure public scrutiny and legal proceedings and internet harassment, and in the end, the men who hurt them will face no consequences. It tells potential perpetrators that they can operate with impunity as long as they're rich enough and connected enough, that the law is a tool for controlling ordinary people, not for holding the powerful accountable. It tells the public that justice is a fiction, that the system they're supposed to trust is fundamentally rigged in favor of those who need it least. Prince Andrew was convicted. That's more than nothing. It's historic. A prince found guilty. But even that unprecedented outcome exceeds anything American perpetrators have faced. The UK showed that accountability is possible when protection finally fails. The palace sacrificed one embarrassing member to preserve the institution. It wasn't perfect justice for Virginia Giuffre or for any of Epstein's other victims, but it was real. It was criminal. It was a conviction. America hasn't even managed that. The institutions that should be protecting the public have instead protected the powerful. The prosecutors who should be pursuing cases have instead closed files and issued statements about the difficulty of international investigations. The politicians who should be demanding accountability have instead accepted donations from people connected to Epstein and moved on to the next news cycle. Hundreds of men were involved. Only one has been convicted, and only after years of institutional protection failed. The man at the center died conveniently. Everyone else walks free. Is this fair? You already know the answer. The question isn't whether it's fair. The question is what happens next. The question is whether the momentum from Andrew's conviction, the proof that even a prince can be held accountable, can be sustained and directed at the American figures who faced nothing. Because here's what we know. Pressure works. The investigation that led to Andrew's arrest happened because public attention made continued protection untenable. The same dynamic can work in America. The same pressure that finally broke the wall around Andrew can break the walls around the Americans who faced nothing. But it requires sustained attention. It requires refusing to let the story fade. It requires naming names and demanding answers, and not accepting the convenient claim that these cases are just too complex to pursue. The flight logs are public. The court documents are being unsealed. The victim testimony is on record. The evidence exists. What's needed is the will to use it. Jeffrey Epstein built a network that spanned continents and decades. He recruited the vulnerable and entertained the powerful. He operated in plain sight, protected by money and connections and a system designed to serve people like him. When he was finally caught, the system arranged for him to serve minimal time. When he was caught again, the system arranged for him to die before he could testify. The system is still operating in America. The people who benefited from that system are still protected by it. The victims who were exploited by that system are still waiting for justice. Prince Andrew's conviction changed something fundamental. It removed one protected figure and demonstrated that the architecture of protection can be breached. The wall isn't impenetrable. A prince can fall. The most lasting consequence may be the shattering of the illusion that had sustained the most powerful men implicated in the Epstein network. The belief that they were untouchable. Andrew's conviction proved that the systems can fail. The wall can be breached. The prince fell. And if a prince can fall, what protection do any of them truly have? That's not enough, but it's a start. Andrew faces the consequences of his actions. He wasn't just stripped of titles, he was convicted. The American associates of Jeffrey Epstein don't even face scrutiny. They haven't paid settlements. They haven't lost positions. They haven't admitted anything. They continue their lives as if the whole sordid business had nothing to do with them. Hundreds of men were involved. One was convicted. The rest paid nothing. The flight logs are still public. The names are still there. The evidence is still waiting for prosecutors willing to use it. The UK showed that conviction is possible. It's America's turn to act on their horrible people. The question echoing through every courthouse, every comment section, every protest outside the institutions that failed these victims. The question that won't go away no matter how much the powerful wish it would. remains unanswered. Hundreds of men were involved, and only one faced criminal consequences. A conviction, yes, but just one. Not anything close to what the victims deserved when you count the full scope of the network. And that was more than America has delivered. So what happens next? Either the pressure continues and the American system eventually cracks, or the story fades, the attention moves on, and the powerful congratulate themselves on surviving another scandal. The choice isn't up to prosecutors or politicians or palace officials. The choice is up to everyone who refuses to accept that justice only applies to people without money or connections or royal blood. Hundreds of men were involved. Only one faced criminal consequences. That's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the demand for a better one. Subscribe for more stories like this.